Welcome to our lecture series, Paving the Path from Language to Literacy for Young Deaf Learners. I'm Connie from York University in Toronto, Canada.
And I'm Beverly from DePaul University in Chicago in the United States.
And we're really pleased to be able to do this lecture series together as we present together quite often. I'm kind of the writing person.
And I've focused more on reading. And we met about 12 years ago now. We met at a conference, and we connected because we are of like thinking. We were actually sitting in a room listening to a lecture, and afterwards, I was kind of new in the field, sitting there listening, thinking, I don't agree, but I'm too new, I don't know what to say. Then Connie stood up and said exactly what I was thinking. I went up to her afterwards and I said, we need to talk. And that's where our friendship and our collaboration began at that conference about 12 years ago.
And most recently, that collaboration has resulted in a book on early literacy development. And a lot of this presentation series that we're going to do for you today, or begin today, is on the back of that book and the work we've been doing together since that meeting 12 years ago. So for this particular lecture series, we have a number of learning objectives that we hope we achieve with you when you're finished watching it. The first is a really broad objective to just really think about what we know about how children learn to read and write in the early years.
And to inform the practice that we do with deaf students, we want to consider the evidence base from both hearing learners as well as those who are deaf or hard of hearing.
And on the back of that evidence base, to think about the strategies for supporting literacy development in those children from birth through the preschool years.
And then also taking that information and thinking about how that can inform what teachers and parents are doing with young literacy learners before they begin schooling. We've organized the lecture series in 8 different topics. They're displayed here on the screen.
It's kind of a hierarchical fashion. One lecture builds on the one before, so that we hope that when you watch them, you watch the series and understand that what we start out saying, everything kind of builds to a climax at the end, so that that by the time you come to the end of it, we hope you have a sense of what we see as the path from language to literacy for young deaf learners.
In further organizing the presentations, we've kind of titled them A and B. A is going to focus more on the research base, what we know, what children should be doing. And then the lectures marked as B are those that are more what can you do to make sure that children stay on that path, what activities are you doing with them? What are more of the practical applications? So what you should be doing is A, and how you should be doing it is within the B.
And often at the uni when we're teaching, it's this sort of tension between theory and practice. So we don't want to make it quite that simplistic that the A lectures are the theory and the B lectures are the practice, but it is really trying to present a sense of not only what to do, but why are you doing what you're doing and what makes good sense and what's the evidence base behind it. And then in this series, we've also, being the teachers that we are very organized, we like to think, so that each presentation concludes with a key point as well as some implications for deaf learners.
We've also created a resource pack for you that will include all the references that we include in the lecture series, as well as the links to the website. We hope that that'll really help you so you're not having to jot those down while we're presenting. They'll all be within this packet for you after you've listened to the series.
So now on to the first presentation in our series that we've entitled From Language to Literacy. In this first presentation, we're really going to focus on how language is the foundation for literacy and start to explore this path that takes babies from birth, when they don't have any language at all, through to schooling when we're already expecting them to learn to read and write. What does that path look like? What needs to be going on during those years?
If you also think about that path, it's like, what are the mile markers? What are the milestones? What should we be looking for in young children from birth to about age 5 or 6 when we're starting to do formal literacy instruction?
So the specific learning objectives for this presentation focus a lot on the 4 conditions necessary for language acquisition. That what needs to be in place for children to acquire that language that forms the foundation for literacy, and as well thinking about how in the current context some of those language acquisition conditions have been impacted on.
We'll also explain in great depth how language underpins literacy development and discuss what it means when children are talking their way into text.
And for those of us who've been in the field for a while, we know that that path from language to literacy, in other words, that path from birth to becoming a reader and writer, has not always been an easy one for deaf children. In fact, one could look at the research literature in our field and be overwhelmed by the data that says most of the students that we have worked with in the past did not find it an easy go to get from birth to reading and writing and ultimately to become age-appropriate readers and writers. Often it's easiest, or we like to illustrate that with examples. And so here's an example that looks probably familiar to many of you who've been teachers of the deaf for any length of time. This is a young 8-year-old deaf student writing about her trip to the zoo, and she says, "I go to outside. I go waiting soon, start school bus. People line door, walked in the school bus and sit down. The bus driver traveled far to the zoo. Wait soon, then stop." That probably illustrates better than any words I can use the challenges our children faced typically in developing as readers and writers. And sorry, Beverly.
That's okay. What's interesting is if you show that to somebody who's not a deaf educator, I've had friends say, "Is that a haiku? Are they writing backwards? I'm having a hard time understanding that." Now, from us who've been deaf educators and we're familiar with that type of syntax in writing, we understand. We understand what the student's saying. We understand that they had to wait to get on the bus. We understand that they went to the zoo. But to a naive reader, the message is not clear.
And I think the biggest challenge, or we think the biggest challenge, is if this was just a glitch and you somehow got to where you needed to be in the end game, it wouldn't be such a worry. But we know from the research, and also, again, as you can see in this writing sample, that when you're writing that way or you're operating that way at 8 years old, you don't end up at the end game being a proficient reader and writer. This sample is written by a deaf college student. He's writing about deep sea diving, and he says, "Two smart men have the equipment to the depth of ocean with bullhead and heavy outfit. Impossible to go there, but it is successful." For those of you who aren't signers, you might wonder, what is bullhead? Well, if you sign helmet, it looks an awful lot like bullhead when you write it down. So someone who's in college writing at that level, they're going to have a very difficult time managing math, science, English, subject areas, and most importantly, reading and writing at the level you need to get a job to do further education.
And I think that one of the things we always talk about when we look at these writing samples is to say these students, they have ideas. They just don't have the tools to communicate those ideas to others. So, and we would argue that that tool is that underlying language, the English language that's needed.
If we want to look at, because we've said we're going to bring the evidence base to bear on our discussion, that this isn't just what we think, we'd like to suggest that this is what we know from the evidence base. If we look at the literacy outcomes in the past for deaf learners broadly, 80% of students with hearing loss read at a below basic level on the Stanford Achievement Tests, with 50% below a 4th grade level. A 4th grade level doesn't get you far at the uni or employment or even in life. It's a real challenge. And so that one could almost say that is the disability, not being able to read and write. Only about 3% read at the same level as the average 18-year-old hearing reader, and more than 30% leave school functionally illiterate. That has been our history in literacy education for deaf children.
And these are students graduating from high school, reading at a 4th grade reading level. The outcomes for writing have also been quite poor, with a typical 17 to 18-year-old deaf student writing commensurate with about an 8 to 10-year-old hearing student.
But as Beverly said, it's not even that really, because if you look at those samples, it's difficult to find any hearing children, even if they're 8 or 10, who write in a fashion that looks like the way that deaf children write. And those examples speak louder, we would suggest, than any words that we can attach to them.
There have been some suggestions in the literature that deaf children start out on a similar trajectory, but then the gap really begins to widen over time. And that's where they're not ending up where they need to be along this path.
And I think this is why we wanted to use that metaphor for this presentation, this notion of somehow we have believed that deaf children start out in this path in kind of a similar way to hearing children, and that at a point it's kind of diverging and we lose them. our suggestion in this presentation is it's right from day one that the issues become problematic, and that they were never really on the same path in the past in the first place, and hence we didn't end up where we needed to be.
So looking a little bit more at the research that informs what we're going to be talking about in this series, a review by Williams in 2004, she looked at early emergent literacy research, and she found fewer than 20 studies on this topic. And again, we have a very thin evidence base on which we're working from.
And isn't it funny to think we've been saying to you, it's a huge challenge. It's been a challenge historically. It's a challenge I think probably every deaf educator watching this series can relate to. And yet the research we have done has been thin, where compared to in the world of hearing children, we could fill this room with the amount of research on early literacy in hearing children.
In this review, and looking specifically at emergent literacy skills, Williams looked at both studies of reading and writing. And in reading, she found that most of these studies looked at storybook reading, and storybook reading from two different perspectives, from the perspective of what teachers are doing with storybook reading, as well as what parents are doing from home. So that was the largest portion in the area of reading. In terms of writing, Connie, do you want to talk a bit about that?
And in writing, people looked at aspects of the process, but not so much at anything about instructional approaches, how to teach writing to deaf children.
So at the end of her review of emergent literacy, Sherry Williams suggested that further research was warranted. She had suggested different strategies about going about the research, such as doing things such as in-depth case studies, as well as more longitudinal work. So again, there's some suggestion that the path at the beginning is the same, but then they diverge off. And if we're not following children over time, we're not sure why they're diverging off, where they diverge off, how can we prevent some of that path being along the wrong way? I don't know how.
Heading off in the wrong direction.
Exactly. So a more recent review, Connie, I'll let you get started.
Yes, Sherry and I did this review together on following up on the work that she'd done in 2004. We went to look specifically at studies of early writing. And again, isn't it surprising? Only 17 studies in that whole time frame, 17 studies in an area where we know children have major difficulties. And to no great surprise, really, the majority of studies were associated with spelling as opposed to writing text. And we found that, I think the reason that happens is because it's easier to look at the spelling of single words than it is to look at text. And so people look at that because it's much easier to get a hold of and to talk about. There was almost no research on instruction, zero. So we had a lot of studies looking at how deaf children spell, and there were only 17 studies in total.
What I was really interested about the review that Connie and Sherry had done was about what they found about the views on phonology. That's an area that I've focused a lot of my research on, and that how it came out in these studies of writing. That there seems to be two views on the role of phonology in writing for deaf students, with kind of some tension within groups about its role. On the one hand, there's researchers who believe that children can bypass phonology in learning to spell, learning to read, learning to write, and others, and I would fall into this camp, of individuals who believe that you must have those prerequisite knowledge of phonology to not only read but also to spell and to write. And I think that that's, again, a point in which we kind of came together within our work, is around that shared notion that these prerequisites that apply to hearing students also apply to children who are deaf.
Because one of the things that we would suggest gets missed often in the discussions of phonology, and we'll be picking up on a lot of these themes through the next set of presentations, is we talk a lot about phonology in reading and about decoding, but we forget that phonology plays an equally important part in writing in terms of encoding and spelling.
So as part of our book, we also had a chapter that looked at the literature in early literacy development and instruction for deaf students. Our parameters for our search were from birth through the start of formal schooling. So we included children who were kindergarten age or 5-6-year-olds in our body of studies. When we looked and searched, we found, again, only 27 studies, and this we set no parameters in terms of the years, just what was out there, what do we know. 27 studies. We found that the 27 studies grouped into 7 different categories. So again, not if you think about that 27 across 7 areas, there's not a lot of research on any one topic. The largest group of studies had 8, and these were focused a lot on phonology as it relates to reading and intervention studies in that area. We also noted that there was a relatively small number of participants in any one study. Now, that's not very surprising given that it is a low incidence disability. There aren't a lot of deaf children, and then when you're looking specifically at young literacy learners within a particular age group, it is going to be hard to have a large number of participants.
And I think most disturbing, if you really think about a notion of path and our metaphor of path, if you have to think about research along a path by necessity is going to be longitudinal. So only looking at children at age 4 who are just starting in the very early steps of early literacy development, you're not going to find out whether that bears fruit unless you track them over time. And it is really quite stunning to look at the research in our field and discover there is almost none. There's almost no longitudinal research that tracks children over time to see that what we're doing from the get-go actually takes kids to where they need to be in terms of age-appropriate outcomes at the end of the day. And so it's not forces us, it requires us in terms of looking at an evidence base for the work that we do and for this presentation to draw on the huge body of literature that we have around early literacy development in hearing children, because that is an area that's hugely researched.
And one of the things that we looked at when we were writing this book is we looked at the research not only on hearing children, but other populations of students such as English language learners, hearing children who have language deficits, and trying to draw from that body of literature as well. So I think we come to this presentation series with a good, solid foundation in what we know about early literacy development in children in general.
And then how we take that and make sense of it in terms of deaf children in the sense of, are they different? How different are they? And what does that mean for both theory and practice? And all of this is most important, we would suggest now, at a time in our field that is really earth-shattering. For those of us who've been around, I work with folks in the UK and some of them who are now retired to say, I see things happening in our field now that I could never have imagined when I started. And I think both of us feel that way. It is a changed, and even more than changed, continually changing context. The first piece that has shifted the ground in our field was newborn hearing screening, which, as far as we understand in Australia, is fairly widely implemented. And it means that children now are identified as typically by 6 months or earlier. Unlike in the day when sometimes children wouldn't be identified, particularly with milder hearing losses, well into 3, 4, 5 years old or older. But sort of concomitant with that, or connected with that, is not only just earlier identification, it's the incredible advances in hearing technologies, which the list is now almost, it feels sometimes like science fiction, some of the things that can happen. Brainstem implants. Cochlear implants now are just kind of an everyday occurrence, where even 25 years ago, they were something that was groundbreaking. Now they're usual, they're typical in increasing numbers, bilateral implants with kids being implanted typically now before the age of 1. All of that shift in the context, we would suggest, changes the landscape so that we now have improved opportunities for shifting this path for age-appropriate language development that we are going to suggest sets the foundation or the basis for early literacy development. And from that, changing expectations. And this is where the weight's on our shoulders as educators. We can no longer get by with saying, this child reads and writes well for a deaf student. We now have to say, this child reads and writes well, full stop. That we have a new benchmark in our field, that deaf children are going to be reading and writing as well as their hearing age peers. All of them, or maybe all of them, we're going to explore that. And most importantly in this presentation, we were going to explore what that means for the early years. What do we need to think about differently and do differently from birth through early schooling so that we can shift more children on to those age-appropriate outcomes?
And this is where we're going to pause. And in the next portion of the lecture series, we'll pick up from there and talk about that very first step in the path from language to literacy.
And to answer the question, how can we get there from here?